The delivery had already been canceled when Ruth Calder walked behind the farm co-op and saw the fish. Just over 8,000 Redear Sunfish, each one small enough to disappear in the shadow of her thumb, were circling inside two steel transport tanks on the back of a hatchery truck. The driver had nowhere to leave them. The customer who ordered them had backed out. The co-op had no space to hold them, and the nearest buyer the driver could reach was several hours south. By sundown, he was going to turn around with a load of fish nobody in central Missouri seemed to want. Ruth looked into the tank and asked one question. "What do they eat?" The driver shrugged. "Snails, mostly. Folks down south call them shell crackers." That answer cost Ruth almost a month's grocery money, because for 3 years, she had been cutting yellow cysts out of bluegill fillets from her farm ponds. She had blamed bad luck, then dirty water, then too many birds, then too many fish. But she had also noticed something nobody had asked her to count: snails. Hundreds of them in the shallow grass every spring. So while the men at the co-op argued about whether Redear belonged this far north, Ruth bought the canceled load. She did not know if the fish would solve anything. She only knew she finally had a way to test the question everybody else had treated like an annoyance. In the spring of 1989, Ruth Calder was 56 years old and running a cattle and hay farm by herself. Her husband, Neil, had died 2 winters earlier. He had left behind 2 tractors, one with a weak hydraulic pump, 74 head of cattle, a mortgage Ruth understood better than the banker assumed, and 3 farm ponds that had been part food supply, part recreation, and part family tradition for as long as she could remember. Ruth had cleaned fish at the same enamel-top table in her utility room since the early 1960s. She knew the ordinary marks of a pond fish: mud in the gills, hook scars, torn fins, the pale flesh of a fish that had been kept too long on ice. The yellow cysts were different. They showed up under the skin and in the muscle, sometimes 1 or 2. Sometimes enough that Ruth stopped trimming and threw the whole fillet into the scrap bucket. The county agent had told her the condition was common, and usually more unpleasant than dangerous once the fish was properly cooked. That was not the answer Ruth cared about. She wanted to know why one pond on her farm produced so many affected fish, and another, less than half a mile away, produced fewer. The standard pond advice she had been given was simple: largemouth bass, bluegill, and channel catfish in recommended proportions. Then manage harvest and fertility. Ruth did that. Her father had done it. Neil had done it. The formula was not foolish. It produced fish. But it did not explain the yellow cysts. By the summer of 1988, Ruth had begun keeping her own count. Every time she cleaned fish, she made 3 pencil marks on a piece of butcher paper taped above the sink. 1 column for clean fish, 1 for fish with a few visible cysts, 1 for fish she considered heavily affected. At the end of the season, she had no university-quality experiment. She had a kitchen wall full of pencil marks, but one thing bothered her. The pond with the worst fillets was also the pond where she could drag a garden rake through the shallows and come up with weeds crawling with small freshwater snails. Ruth did not yet know whether the 2 observations were connected. She only knew they lived in the same water. That winter, she started asking questions, not at conferences, not in laboratories. She asked at the feed store. She asked a private hatchery. She called a state office and was transferred 3 times. She asked the librarian in town to help her find old pond management bulletins from southern states, where farm ponds had longer growing seasons and more warm water species in common use. The answers did not all agree. Some people told her snails were simply part of a pond. Some told her parasite cycles were too complicated for a farmer to manage with fish stocking. One hatchery employee told her that Redear Sunfish fed heavily on mollusks and crushed shells with grinding teeth in the throat. That was the first answer Ruth could connect to something she could physically see. If the snails mattered, and if Redear ate snails, then the question could be tested. Not proven in a conversation. Tested. Then in April, the canceled hatchery truck appeared behind the co-op. Ruth did not buy the fish because she was certain. She bought them because uncertainty had finally become measurable. The co-op manager tried to talk her out of it. "You don't even know they'll overwinter," he said. "No," Ruth said. "I don't. You don't know they'll touch your snail problem." "No. Then what exactly are you buying?" Ruth looked at the tanks. An answer. She brought the fish home in the hatchery truck because her own equipment could not safely move that many at once. The driver helped her release most of them into two of the deeper ponds. She put a smaller group into the shallow west pond, the one with the heaviest snail growth and the worst parasite counts. Then she did something that would matter more than buying the fish. She left the third pond alone. Same farm, same general weather, same base bluegill catfish system, no Redear, a comparison. Ruth had never taken a statistics course, but she understood fences, feed trials, calf weights, and the difference between changing one thing and changing 5 things at once. If she fertilized one hayfield and not another, she did not pretend the difference in yield came from prayer. If a sick calf recovered after 3 treatments at once, she did not pretend she knew which treatment worked. So she made rules for herself. No major stocking changes in the comparison pond. No herbicide in the test ponds unless all ponds required it. Record fish harvest by pond. Record visible cysts. And 4 times a year, drag the same homemade wire basket through marked sections of shoreline and count the snails it collected. The basket was ugly. It was made from hardware cloth, baling wire, and a broken broom handle. It became the most important tool on the farm that nobody else respected. By June, Ruth had numbers. By August, she had confusion. The snail counts in the deepest test pond had fallen a little, but the west pond had barely changed. Worse, the Redear in that shallow pond were difficult to find in her sampling. She caught bluegill. She caught small bass. She caught catfish. The Redear seemed to have vanished. At the county farm meeting that September, Ruth mentioned what she was doing. She did not present it as a discovery. She said she was testing whether a mollusk-eating sunfish could reduce the snail population in ponds with recurring yellow grub problems. Sam Vickers, who managed private ponds for a living, asked how many years of data she had. 5 months, Ruth said. A few people laughed. Sam did not. That was almost worse. He gave her the careful smile of a man trying to save someone from an expensive mistake. "Ruth, those fish are used farther south for a reason. A Missouri winter can settle this experiment before your snails ever know they're there," Ruth said. "Then winter is part of the test." Sam folded his arms. "And if they die, then I write that down." That answer changed the room. Not because anybody suddenly believed her. Because it made clear she was not trying to win an argument. She was trying to find the boundary of an idea. The boundary arrived in January. A hard, cold spell locked the west pond under ice. Snow covered much of the surface. Ruth cut a small opening near the bank and saw fish near the hole, slow and crowded. When the thaw came, she found dead Redear along the south edge. Not all of them. Enough. For 2 mornings she walked the shoreline with a 5-gallon bucket and picked up fish she had paid to bring north. The shallowest pond, the pond where she most wanted the experiment to work, had become the experiment's first clear failure. Ruth counted the dead fish she could recover. She noted the ice duration. She noted the depth near the sampling area. She noted that the deeper ponds did not show the same loss. Then she stopped writing. For the first time since she had bought the fish, she wondered if Sam Vickers had been right in the only way that mattered. Maybe the biological idea made sense, but the practical system did not. A fish that ate snails in warm water was not useful if the pond could not carry it through winter. That night Ruth considered ending the trial. She did not like wasting money. She disliked wasting animals even more. But in the morning she returned to the west pond with the wire basket. The basket came up with weeds, mud, 2 fingernail-sized clams, and fewer snails than she expected. One pull meant nothing, so she ran the marked route again. Then she drove to the deeper south pond and repeated the same pulls. The difference there was harder to ignore. The basket that had come up speckled with snails the previous spring now held scattered shells and mud. Ruth did not celebrate. She made a new page in her records. At the top, she wrote one sentence: "Do not confuse failure in one pond with failure of the mechanism." Below it, she wrote another: "Do not confuse success in one pond with proof for every pond." Those 2 sentences became the discipline that kept the rest of the story from turning into a miracle. The following spring, Ruth changed the trial. She did not restock the shallow west pond immediately. Instead, she treated it as evidence of a limitation. Depth mattered. Winter conditions mattered. Stocking a species because it had one useful feeding behavior did not erase every other condition a pond demanded. In the 2 deeper ponds, she continued sampling. The Redear were larger now. She began catching them on light tackle near the edges of vegetation. When she cleaned a few, she found the thick crushing structures in the throat that people had described to her. She also began finding broken snail shells in places where the previous year she had found living snails attached to stems. That did not prove every shell had been crushed by Redear, but the shoreline counts were changing in the same direction. Her wire basket produced fewer live snails in the stocked ponds. The comparison pond did not show the same decline. Then the fillet counts began to separate. In the comparison pond, the pattern looked familiar. Some harvests were better than others, but yellow cysts remained common enough that Ruth kept the trimming knife beside the cutting board. In the 2 deeper stocked ponds, the proportion of visibly affected fish began dropping. Not to 0, not immediately, but enough that by the end of the second full season, Ruth no longer needed intuition to describe the difference. In her kitchen records, roughly 4 out of every 10 fish from the comparison pond showed at least one visible cyst. In the better-performing stocked pond, the count was closer to 1 in 10. The exact numbers moved from harvest to harvest. The direction did not. Ruth had expected the first convincing proof to come from a fish survey. Instead, it came from a church supper. Every October, families in the area brought fish, beans, cornbread, and pies to the fellowship hall behind the Methodist church. Ruth usually helped clean whatever fish arrived late. That year she brought 2 coolers. One held fish from the comparison pond. The other held fish from the deeper stocked pond. She did not label them by treatment. She marked the bags with letters only. Then she asked Helen Cobb, who had cleaned fish beside her for 20 years and had no patience for Ruth's experiments, to count visible yellow cysts before the fillets went into the washpan. Helen agreed on one condition: "If I find no difference, you buy my pie at the auction." Ruth said, "If you find a difference, I'll buy it anyway." They cleaned fish for more than an hour. Helen trimmed. Ruth wrote down the marks. Near the end, Helen stopped and looked at the 2 pans. One scrap bowl held noticeably more trimmed pieces than the other. "Which pond is this?" she asked. Ruth pointed to the letter on the bag. Helen stared at it, then at Ruth. "That's the shellcracker pond? One of them." Helen picked up another fillet and held it toward the fluorescent light. "Clean." She put it in the pan. "You need somebody official to see this," she said. Ruth laughed once. "Official people have been available the whole time. Then invite one." That winter, Ruth called Ed Morrow at the county extension office. Ed had answered her questions before. He had never mocked the trial, but he had never encouraged it either. His job was to recommend practices with a dependable history behind them. He did not consider a farm woman's kitchen marks enough reason to change a county handout. Ruth understood that. So she did not ask him to change anything. She asked him to inspect her method. Ed arrived on a cold morning in February with a clipboard and the expression of a man expecting to spend 30 minutes being polite. He stayed nearly 4 hours. Ruth showed him the maps of the ponds, the marked sampling routes, the stocking notes, the winter kill in the shallow pond, the snail counts, the harvest dates, the cyst tallies, and the church supper comparison. Ed's first question was the right one. What else changed? Ruth showed him the records. No major fertilizer change, no herbicide difference that separated the ponds, no complete restocking, no sudden fish removal that would obviously explain the pattern. You know this isn't a controlled university study, Ed said. I know, your sample sizes wander. I know, you lost fish in the shallow pond. I know. Ed turned several pages. But you kept the pond that didn't get Redear. Ruth nodded. That was the point. He looked toward the window. The south pond was visible beyond the barn, dark under a thin winter sky. Then he asked to see the wire basket. Ruth took him outside. The basket looked even worse after 2 seasons. One side had been repaired with copper wire. The handle was split and wrapped with tape. Ed held it up. This is your snail sampler? That's it. You use the same distance every time? Same markers, same number of pulls, same parts of the bank, as close as weather lets me. Ed handed it back. Do it. The pond edge was cold enough to numb Ruth's fingers through her gloves. She dragged the basket through the first marked section, pulled it onto the bank, and spread the contents over a shallow pan. Mud, dead leaves, plant stems, several small shells, 2 live snails. Ed counted them himself. They repeated the pull. Then they drove to the comparison pond. The basket came up heavier there. Ed did not say the experiment was proven. He did not say Ruth had discovered anything new. He said something more useful. I think your question is real. For Ruth, that was enough, because the fight had never been over whether a southern sunfish was magical. The fight was over whether a pond problem deserved to be identified before somebody prescribed the standard answer. Ed began helping her improve the records. He suggested keeping effort more consistent during fish sampling. He suggested separating parasite presence from severity, instead of putting both into one count. He encouraged her to record pond temperature and approximate water level, so a dry summer or severe winter would not disappear from the story the numbers told. Ruth accepted every correction that made the test harder to fool. What she did not accept was the idea that a farmer's observation had to remain unofficial until an institution invented it again. That summer, the county experienced a long, hot stretch. The Redear ponds did not suddenly become perfect. One had an algae bloom. Another needed aeration during a windless week. Bass conditions still depended on forage and harvest. Catfish still needed management. And in the shallow west pond, Ruth remained cautious about reintroducing Redear until she had improved depth and winter refuge. The species had not replaced pond management. It had become one tool inside it. That distinction mattered. By the 3rd autumn, Ruth's records showed the same broad pattern she had seen the year before. Snail counts remained lower in the 2 suitable ponds where Redear had survived. Visible yellow grub incidents in harvested fish remained well below the comparison pond, and the Redear themselves had become catchable panfish rather than invisible experimental stock. Ed Morrow asked permission to bring 2 other pond owners to the farm. Ruth said yes. Then 4 came. Then 9. They did not come to hear a speech. Ruth made them drag the wire basket. She made them look at the pond depth. She showed them the winter loss page before she showed them the best parasite numbers. That irritated some people. They wanted the success story first. Ruth refused. If you don't see where it failed, she told them, you'll use it wrong. Sam Vickers came in the third group. He had not lost sleep over Ruth's experiment. He had clients, equipment, and years of pond work behind him. But by then, several customers were asking him about Redear, and he had decided he would rather inspect the evidence than argue with it secondhand. Ruth showed him the records in the same order. Shallow pond winter loss first, survival in deeper ponds second, snail counts third, fillet counts last. Sam read quietly. When he finished, he asked, "What stocking rate are you telling people?" Ruth said, "I'm not." That surprised him. "Then what are you telling them?" "Find out what problem they have. Find out whether the pond can support the fish. Then decide whether Redear belongs in the answer." Sam looked at Ed. Ed said, "That's about where I am too." The old pond formula had been useful because it was simple, but simplicity had quietly turned into certainty. Bass, bluegill, catfish. The answer before the question. Ruth's experiment did not prove the old formula wrong. It proved it could be incomplete. A pond could produce fish and still carry a problem the standard combination did not target. A parasite problem could look like bad luck until somebody followed the life cycle far enough to see the snail in the middle. A fish dismissed as unnecessary could become useful not because it was exotic, but because it occupied a feeding niche the standard combination left open. The change at the extension office was small. That was another reason Ruth trusted it. Ed did not tear up the county pond handout and replace it with a picture of a Redear Sunfish. He added a conditional note to the next revision. For ponds with persistent mollusk-associated parasite problems, and where local conditions were suitable, managers should consider species that feed heavily on snails as part of an integrated plan. No promise, no miracle. A question inserted before the prescription. Sam Vickers changed his client interviews too. He started asking whether pond owners saw snails, whether they had recurring parasite problems, how deep their ponds were, and what had happened during recent winters. Sometimes he recommended Redear. Sometimes he did not. That was the point. The fish were no longer an argument. They were an option with conditions. By the early 1990s, the co-op that had once tried to talk Ruth out of buying the canceled load began taking advance orders for Redear before spring delivery. The first year, the order sheet was 1 page. The second year, it was several. Ruth never claimed credit for introducing the fish to the region. She had no way to know who had stocked what before her, and she was not interested in becoming a legend built on a claim she could not prove. What she did claim was narrower. On her farm, in ponds where the fish survived, and the comparison could be followed, the snail numbers changed, the parasite counts changed. And the difference was large enough that other people could see it without borrowing her conviction. That was the standard she cared about. One autumn afternoon, years after the canceled delivery, Ruth walked the south pond with the repaired wire basket. Ed was no longer with her, neither was Sam. There was no farm tour that day and no meeting afterward. She dragged the basket through the first marked section because the season's last sample was due. The basket scraped through weeds and mud, then came up against the bank. Ruth tipped it into the shallow pan. Leaves, stems, a few clamshell fragments, and one small snail shell crushed clean through the middle. Ruth rinsed the mud from it, set it beside the pan, and made one mark on the page.